Good afternoon. So with my colleague Peter, we have prepared a presentation entitled The Net Land Take Strategy, a Last Hope for Urban Containment in Belgium. So briefly, an introduction about the context. So Belgium is a federal state. Currently in Belgium, we have 3 regions, so Brussels in the center, Flanders in the north, this region has already been mentioned, which is the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, and Wallonia in the south, which is the French-speaking part of Belgium. And since the 80s, the 3 regions actually exercise full legislative power in the domain of planning. So that means there are increasing differences when it relates to the planning system, but still we have the same roots, I would say, and concerning in particular property rights that I will discuss, we definitely have similar philosophical underpinnings. So Belgium is a federal state. Belgium is also a country with a very strong urban sprawl, or to come back to what David mentioned, a quite strong diffuse urbanization. So we discussed Korean. Here it's a map based on Korean data. So you see the ratio between surfaces of urban fabrics and the population number. And you see that based on those data, basically in the Netherlands or in the UK, they need something like 200 square meters to house 1 inhabitant. And in Belgium, on average, it's something like 500. It's even more in Wallonia, for instance, with more than 600 square meters per inhabitant. So very strong land consumption, or very diffuse urbanization. But still in Belgium, there are political ambitions to limit sprawl, I would say. And this is related to the topic of the day. So ZAN in French, or no net land take in English, following this roadmap to a resource-efficient Europe that was published in 2011. And in 2016, in Flanders, the regional authority decided to follow this objective with this no net land take by 2050. And in 2018, they were even more ambitious with the idea to achieve this objective by 2040. And in Wallonia, we have had this decision in 2019 on the regional master plan to achieve this net land take strategy by 2050. So that was my brief introduction. Concerning the following of the presentation, we have structured that in 2 parts. So in the first part, I will try to explain why we don't really see how we will achieve those objectives, because the situation seems to be very much locked in currently. So I will try to explain this with an historical perspective related to property rights. And then Peter will continue, and he will anyway try to answer the following question: is it possible to unlock this current situation, with the current strategies? So concerning the historical perspective, I propose to focus on property right with this concept of property right regime. Working definition of the concept would be the rules that are governing the allocation of land values, increase of land values, also decrease of land values between, on the one hand, private actors like landowners, developers, and on the other hand, public authorities. And what we see in Belgium, for deep historical reasons, is a property right regime that is very much in favor of property right, of private property right. And here I can mention what seems to be really the key historical reason. It has been developed by a quite famous Belgian historian called Henri Pirenne. Henri Pirenne has worked in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and he has notably analyzed what happened in the late 18th century in relation to the events of the French revolutions, with vente des biens nationaux, or sales of national assets. So as you know, the land of the church was sold. And in this period, Belgium was already urbanized. Belgium was already emerging in terms of industrialization. And the industrial business community has been able to take profit of it. So the urban bourgeoisie has been able to buy lots of those land that were sold by the in relation to this vente des biens nationaux. And following Henri Pirenne, it has led to a kind of merger, or kind of integration between, again, on the one hand, the business interest, and on the other hand, land property interest. And it looks like for decades, this very powerful social class has been able to defend property rights, and this has had impact on the planning systems. So concretely, that can explain why in Belgium we have had to wait 1962 to have a real planning law. For instance, it's maybe 50 years later compared to the Netherlands or to the UK. So of course we had planning before, but it was developed at the scale of the municipalities, of the main cities, and not at the national or at the state level. So we have this lateness of 50 years, and I think this again has nowadays impact consequences. I think this can explain the remaining weak expertise in spatial planning in general, in land use policy. So for instance, to achieve this objective of no let land take, we will need to use quite sophisticated land policy tools, but we just do not have the expertise to do so. What happened also in relation to the 1962 planning law is that the central administration at that time, the national administration, has decided to cover the whole country with zoning plans. We can call them supralocal zoning plans that were defining potentially urban land, notably the residential zones. We call them residential zones where it's possible to develop a residential project. And this was done at the national level because the municipalities were in fact not able to develop their own land use, their own zoning plans. And today, the regions are still in charge of those zoning plans, and that's part of the blockage we have to face. And one reason of the difficulties is also that we incorporated the principle of compensation in the 1962 planning law. So again, this is related to property rights, and more precisely, the principle of compensation for value decrease introduced by land use regulation. So that means when one of those supralocal zoning plans came into force, if the land that was not considered as potentially urban land was not zoned as building land, that means the owner would have to be compensated by the authority, and that explains why we have those I would say urban structure with roadways which are urbanized nowadays. That's because those roadways were considered as potentially urban land when the zoning plans were drawn. So I've prepared this illustration to explain this. That actually relates to what's decided by the judges. So we are talking here about jurisprudence, and three conditions were actually defined by the judge concerning the definition of building land. So building land before the development of the land use plans. So you see the three conditions: being connected to road infrastructure, being adjacent to housing or building plots, meeting technical requirements. And on the right, you see what it gives clearly on the floor. So you have the first image with the traditional settlement. So you see the village with an area with dispersed farm. You see the urban situation, the situation, in 1980, and you see what it could be if whole of the potentially urban land would be built. Probably it's the case already. I have not checked this area in precisely. So this was realized that way because people and planners and the authorities were actually afraid to compensate. So that explains again those linear residential zones and this overabundance in land supply. So here you have an illustration of those land use maps. So what you see in red, but also in orange, I would say, are those residential zones. And we definitely have this overabundance, again, related to this principle of compensation. But today, this principle of compensation still applies. And for instance, concerning Flanders, and Peter will go into details, for Flanders, it has been estimated that to achieve this objective of non-net land take, 6.6 billion would be necessary to compensate and to pay the landowner, which represent 1,000 euro per inhabitant. So I hope you have understood with those developments that property right is very much central, and explain why we have this overabundance, and why we can maybe consider the situation today as definitely locked in. But still, we have those ambitions. And so Peter now will continue with the second part of the presentation about the current strategies that are developed for maybe possible unlocking of the situation. So Peter, I let you now the floor.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. So in order to reduce land take, we need to understand what drives land take, what are the drivers of land take, and that this is for each region and each member state in the European Union can this be different. So the definition, the monitoring and the analysis of the land take, current land take, is very important. And in that way, we can choose measures that could be effective to reduce land take, and customize measures. Measures for Flanders won't be the same for Wallonia or France or whatsoever. And by placing these measures in a sequence, a strategy or a roadmap towards no-net land take can be set up. And that is what we're doing right now for Flanders and Wallonia in a more preparation phase. Not yet many political decisions are taken. A few first steps are taken in Flanders, not yet in Wallonia, but a lot of research is done on the topic. So planners are prepared, but will politicians be willing to go forward with the no-net land take policy? This is the main question. And as demonstrated by Jean-Marie, the downzoning of the oversupply of land is key for Belgium. The main focus in the Belgian context is getting rid of this oversupply on the old binding plans in order to achieve the new policy for the coming decades, and closing the gap between the old binding plans and the new policy, the limits of new policy. So in a way, mathematical, you could say that the difference between the oversupply on the one hand and the land take risk on these old binding plans versus the limit set by a no-net land take policy, well, this is the downzoning targets. So the no-net land take policy results in Belgian context to a downzoning target. And as already also mentioned by Jean-Marie, compensation comes with it, according to the Belgian legislation. And should we compensate, how much, and so on. And there are some remarkable differences evolving between both regions. Whereas Flanders, with its right-wing government, regional right-wing government, a high compensation is foreseen for landowners in order to get their support, the support of landowners for no-net land take policy. Well, a budget of 1.6 billion euros is foreseen and was decided 2 weeks ago. So it's a very topical issue now in Belgium, and for Flanders especially. Whereas in Wallonia, not such a budget is available at all. So other instruments will be needed to reach the no-net land take policy. The no-net land take policy is known in Flanders as the bow shift, also in media betonstop, and it was kind of translated for Wallonia in le zero beton. So people don't know what non-Atlant take policy is in Flanders, but it is known as bouwshift and le zero beton. Yes, Jean-Marie? So measuring is essential, and that is what we did in Ghent University. We differentiated the land take. The land take ratio, daily ratio, is 5.1 hectares a day. And what we did is differentiated this land take ratio according to the different zoning types. And what we found is that half of the land take is found in agricultural zones and not in residential zones or economical zones. So the yellow part here on the circle diagram shows that more than half of land take takes place in Flanders in agricultural zones by outzoned development and so on. And a quarter of it is in residential zones, the red part, and some also in economic zoning. Yes, Jean-Marie? So what we need to do is to confront, on the one hand, the land take risk. So what amount of land is at risk to be taken because of the old binding plans confronted to the trajectory of non-Atlantic policy. And on the left, you can see the land take risk we measured. It's about 60,000 hectares in Flanders that is still at risk because of development area. 1/3 of it is in residential zoning. And on the right hand of this slide, you can see the trajectory for Flanders, starting off from 5.1 hectares now till 0 by 2040. As Jean-Marie mentioned, the regional government of Flanders decided that the non-Atlantic should be achieved 2040, not 2050, but 2040. So the surface under this curve shows the limits of further greenfield development for the coming decades. And it shows here that it is 16,000 hectares together for all different developments in Flanders, 16,000 hectares. So the difference between this 16,000 hectares and the land take risk of 60,000 hectares developable is the part that we should downzone. Yes, Jean-Marie? We also detected these sites. They are spread out over the whole of Flanders. So this shows land that is still in agricultural use or natural use and is at risk to be taken, developable. Some parts, especially in the cores, are interesting to get developed, of course, but the half of it needs to be downzoned. About 30,000 hectares needs downzoning. Another part needs additional regulations to limit land take within the zoning, but rezoning is not necessary for the other half of it. But 30,000 hectares is for Flanders the target of downzoning. This is not approved by the regional government yet. I hope so that they will in the future, but it is not yet set as a quantitative target. Yes, Jean-Marie? What we did with the task force, this was an expert panel that was formed last year. We made kind of a roadmap showing the phasing out of further land take for Flanders. And what we did was we made a kind of phases, and each phase of the downzoning and the reduction of land take has a set of measures. So concrete measures were proposed to the Flemish government for each phase. And in that way, we hope land neutrality could be achieved by 2040 for Flanders. Yes, Jean-Marie? But as already demonstrated by Jean-Marie, the primacy of property rights is very strong in Flanders. So will politicians be willing to go forward with the no-Atlantic policy? Well, first proposal that was made by planners some years ago was to let these old binding plans expire. But this was rejected politically because of legal certainty they want to give to landowners. Although these old binding plans are already 40 years old and will be still in place in the coming years. Also, another proposal was rejected, namely to give compensation rights expiry date. Also, this was rejected. The binding plans will stay in place, and also the right to compensation will stay in place. So what we need to do to achieve non-land take by 2040 is adjust the old plans partially and downzone location per location. So this is quite a lot of work to do for planners and politicians, local politicians. But at the same time, the Flemish government took the decision to increase compensation. So it was like a kind of a political compromise. If we want this bow shift or non-land take, higher compensation is due to landowners, was decided by the right-wing government of Flanders. So the previous estimate Jean-Marie mentioned of 6.6 billion euros could mount up to 31 billion euros for the same downzoning, depending on what the rules of valuation would be of this compensation. And that is not yet decided. But politicians do agree on the fact that compensation should be based on market value. And that is an essential change in the compensation scheme. The one of Wallonia will stay as previous, based on the initial land value paid by the landowner. So this is kind of a counterproductive decision that was taken. Only the construction sector and the landowners naturally are positive about it. The municipalities are not very fond of this new compensation scheme because they have to pay along with the Flemish government for downzoning. And of course, the common taxpayer doesn't understand why he should pay off compensation and nothing changes at all on the terrain. Yes, Jean-Marie? Then, so let's have a look at the other region, the south part of Belgium, Wallonia. We can make the same comparison. On left, the land take risk was measured for 107,000 hectares. So the oversupply is even larger than the one of Flanders. And half of it, of the land take risk in Wallonia, is in residential zones. On the right of the slide, you can see the trajectory to non-land land take for Wallonia, aiming for 2050, not for 2040, but 2050. So this curve also can be calculated and sets the limits of a maximum of additional greenfield development. So this is measured for 13,500 hectares of land. So the difference between the land take risk and the limit set by a no-nat land take policy is even larger than the one in Flanders. Yes, Jean-Marie? Half of it is located in residential zones, so 54,000 hectares, or part of it needs downzoning, especially in the south and the east part of Wallonia, as you can see here. Yes. The next one. Yeah. Similar as in Flanders, also in Wallonia, expert advice group was installed, and these experts formulated also an advice for the regional government based on the Schéma de Développement du Territoire. So these experts elaborated the political first guidelines, and this list of main topics were formulated. For at first, the non-nat land take was already decided by 2050 by the Walloon government, with an intermediate goal of 1.6 hectares a day by 2030. Also, a target is set for a more compact development. Half of the development should be in the course of Wallonia by 2030. Also, a methodology of measurement is needed for Wallonia and in Flanders to measure it better, land take. It was also concluded that the revision of all the land use plans old land use plans is not feasible at all. So adjustment, partially adjustment, will be needed. But Wallonia doesn't has a budget as it is the case in Flanders. So other instruments besides downzoning will be needed. For instance, adding regulations within the zones, so without rezoning, and also putting additional perimeters of protection in these existing zones could also help. Yes, Jean-Marie? But what is not mentioned, and that is quite remarkable in contrast to Flanders, is that Wallonia doesn't make any further plans to change the compensation scheme. So the Walloon region will maintain the existing compensation scheme. And this existing compensation scheme dates back to 1962, as already mentioned by Jean-Marie, and is based on the initial price the landowner paid for the land. So the unearned increment is not taken into account, as it will be in Flanders. And also not the full value is paid back. Only 80% of it will be taken in account. And if the land is not suitable for construction or is not adjacent to an equipped road, no compensation is due to the landowner. So, and this is fundamental difference between the Walloon approach and the Flemish approach. In Wallonia, it is calculated by our colleagues of the University of Liege that 42% can be downzoned without any compensation. So that gives hope for downzoning in the Walloon approach. Yes, Jean-Marie? Where can downzoning or additional regulations be added or get started? Well, of course, some areas are more urgent than others. And some areas are also more sensitive because of their natural value and so on. So what the colleagues of the University of Liege did was measure these more urgent parts of Wallonia. For instance, 900 hectares were detected of flood-prone area. Some parts of Wallonia has constraints on constructions, like because of karst and so on. And more than 1,000 hectares is located in developable area, but has natural value. So this would also be the focus of a first phase of downzoning or additional regulations, and could be, in a way, the first step towards no-net land take for Wallonia and for Flanders. Yes, Jean-Marie. So I hope Jean-Marie and I gave you a first glimpse of how a no-net land take could be operational for Flanders and Wallonia, but it's just first steps, and there's still a lot of political decisions need to be made to move forward. Thank you.